Well, the next question that I wanted us to discuss is just kind of about how we use research and tools in trying to further efforts for racial justice and equity in education. And when we spoke before, you had mentioned that education leaders, in your view, really need to proceed carefully when we use research and tools that either are not specifically from the education field or were not designed with the purpose of racial justice in mind, which systems thinking is neither of those things. And so I would just be interested to hear more about how you approach those kinds of situations, what kind of questions you ask or support others in asking as they're thinking about what kind of tools and research really can be valuable in these efforts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions to ask. I think there's a lot of organizational reflection and sort of values work that should be happening. I mean, every organization should be doing better at that, I think. But for me, the gist of this, I think, is about representation and it's about goals. So in using models or research or sort of schema from other places and sort of applying it, especially applying it to racial equity, a really specific and narrow and complicated focus in schools that has not had the attention in sort of mainstream academia and mainstream educational consultant sectors for a very long time. I think the question has to be whose expertise has been valued, whose expertise has been monetized, rewarded, has been a part of boards, have been a part of decision-making, and for what purposes. And so I think that that's super important because while a model or a way of thinking of something, of an issue might have worked for one issue, but I think when you think about the issue, especially around racism and racial equity, I think people need to be very, very careful about what they try to sort of copy and paste. Not to say that you all did that, but that this is something that's triggered in my mind because I have my own process of unlearning so much that I went to segregated schools were only Asian and white. I went to college where it was 80% white. You know, I had some friends of color that were non-white, but really my whole mental models were based on sort of the status quo. And until I sort of worked with students in communities that were different than mine, Black and brown folks in New York City, and had colleagues that were just had wildly different lived experiences than me, I didn't really know how much I had to unlearn and how much I couldn't just sort of say, well, this worked based on my experience. Shouldn't it just work here? And I think that that's a problem for a lot, especially public school educators, that's not bad intentions, but we know what we know. We know what has worked for us. We know what education should feel and look like. And then we sort of try to apply it in another context without thinking about some of the things that are at the heart of racial equity, right? Which are culture and which are understanding differences in how people view education and resources and access and understanding the history behind all of that is just so important. So I've had to learn that, and I keep learning it sort of every day by reading more and talking to people who are different than me. And so I think in terms of this, I think about we have massively influential organizations, nonprofits that I think definitely are well-intentioned, are trying to do the best. They're trying to provide resources that will help. But I think there's often like a level of reflection that organizations are not at right now. And I think reflection on who is represented in the decision-making, if you're using tools, and I think this happens a lot, especially systems-oriented things, if they've been applied to the business sector, if they've been applied to efficiency-related sort of outcomes, which many are, we have to think deeply around, does that even align with the values of racial equity in schools? Does that align to the goals of communities that sort of need and should be getting adequate, way more than adequate, but an equal education in terms of our taxpayer dollars, our resources. And so I just think that there are deeper conversations to be had around when you apply a systems thinking that was oriented toward being more efficient, getting certain goals that are often like inherited from this sort of capitalistic, corporate, individualistic mentality. When we apply it to especially racial equity and lessening sort of racist gaps that have always existed and continue to exist, I would argue that sometimes that might be misguided or might be missing the mark. I think that and what I've learned about anti-racism having a mindset that's always learning and saying, I don't have all the answers. I'm going to keep asking, trying things out. I think that's part of the process. But I also think that there have been fundamental issues of education from its founding that we have to understand before we try to use sort of models from other fields. And I think there's a way to do it well together, but I also think that any organization needs to really be thinking about who's represented, who's making these decisions, how does it connect to the goals of the guidance. And I wanted to share a quote because I think that this is important, not to be like, and I think we're doing it in this conversation. We don't want to be scared to be making mistakes or not doing the right thing, right? And I think that's part of sort of shopping anything that we're going to put out there as products and sort of saying, here is a draft. We want feedback. We want to call to get more edits. So it's not just we're an organization and this is the thing. That this is a quote from David Gilborn, who writes a couple essays in a book called Developing Anti-Racist Social Policy. And I really love this because I do it all the time. And I need to be okay with the fact that, I'm not going to say the right thing. I'm not going to do the right thing. But it says, anti-racism entails a constant struggle to move toward greater equality. Anti-racist educators must even guard against the possibility that our own actions might inadvertently support the injustices we are working against. And I think about this all the time because in leading implicit bias awareness, in talking about race and racism and its history, I know that I'm not going to say the right thing all the time. I can only speak from my own lens, shop it with folks to say, where are the holes in how I'm thinking about something? And I think that shouldn't prevent us from being really proactive and especially talking to folks who share our identities. And for me, it's often speaking to friends and family members and colleagues who are either Asian or white or have similar experiences to me that we can push each other's thinking.
Yeah, I think all of that is so important as we're thinking about because in my mind, it's the goal, whatever goal we have, and particularly when we're talking about a goal of racial equity, how we go about pursuing it, to me, matters as much as having the goal in the first place. If we're not sort of living the values as we're pursuing the goal, then we're probably not actually pursuing it in a way that's going to get us anywhere. So I think that's right. For me, I feel like what's coming up is I feel like systems thinking at its core really has so much of what you're talking about in the good sense, like that it really is about understanding that my lens is one lens. It's about recognizing that there are historical dynamics at play that we have to unpack. It's about sort of having as many lived experiences represented in your analysis of the system as possible. And I think when I think about the way that I conducted interviews for this project, I was not explicit enough in my questioning, because I know that some of the people we talked to have done some really powerful work with communities, with students that were working on systems problems specifically related to race and racism. But because I framed the questions from my lens and from this idea of let's do this broad systems thinking guidebook, that didn't come out as much. And so it's just it's from the folks that we were talking to and who have used a lot of these tools in their own work. So I think that that's just another example of how, without getting lots of ideas on sort of what we're doing, that I have a tendency to make it follow the line of thinking. I think honestly, I would ask a general question and sort of just believe that it would come out if there was something related to racial equity that was relevant. And instead I needed to be comfortable asking explicitly and saying, how have you seen these tools be useful in creating more racial justice and equity in education, and just really be explicit about that and find those examples a little more clearly. So I think that's part of what's coming up for me in this.
Yeah, I agree. I like that reflection. I also think that in doing this, I just think a diversity of voice, especially racial diversity at the table, is so important, right? Because we know the makeup of a lot of organizations, right? Predominantly white, have always been. And so how do we realize that there is also a level of tokenism that might be happening when organizations or even schools, right? Hiring is not done with an explicit focus on saying we're valuing all different types of voices, but particularly around anti-racism, I think that even in doing facilitation, often it's, I think, really, really great to have multiple different lenses to speak to different audiences, to share different perspectives. It's always something it's really difficult, but you need, I think, folks to understand the history of race, of racism, which I don't think a lot of people do. And to not be afraid to talk about racism, to not be afraid to talk about anti-Blackness, which is a pervasive force, which is the guiding force in racism from its founding and today. That there are folks that fit within different racial categories that always change, but that it has been anti-Blackness that has always been the core element of racism. So people that are like not afraid to talk about those things, and if people in your organization, in any organization, aren't comfortable with that, I really don't think that you can do anything to move the needle around racial equity if we're not going to be able to talk the truth about some of the really big concepts. And even when we sort of say racial equity, racial justice, I think sometimes I know there needs to be on-ramps for folks to be comfortable, but we also know that this has been studied for so long, and people have been screaming at the top of their lungs, fighting for their lives, for their existence, for equity. It's time that people sort of swallow their pride and start rolling up their sleeves and not being scared of the truth and not letting it affect our own sense of our own self-worth.